Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the NHSG's final presentation for 2022. We want to thank you all for taking the time to join us. This evening's presentation is one with a bit of a difference. The title of this presentation is Reimagining Wild Birds in Early African Awareness in Jamaica. And our presenter this evening is Dr. Leah Douglas. Dr. Douglas is a clinical assistant professor at New York University in New York City. He received his PhD, a Master's of Ecology, Evolution, and Environmental Biology, and an Advanced Environmental Policy Certificate from Columbia University. He also holds a Master's of Philosophy degree in Zoology from the University of the West Indies, Mona campus. He's a past president of Birds Caribbean, and he is also an executive member of BirdLife Jamaica. So just a few lines about the presentation. So this presentation will look at Jamaican Afro-Indigenous retentions and the biocultural relationships of the descendants of formerly enslaved peoples of Jamaica, with a focus on Jamaican birds. And this presentation is based on the ongoing Institute of Jamaica exhibit entitled Reimagining Nanny, Her Sword, a Seed. And this visual arts exhibition that is now going on questions and presents a re-examining of the lived experiences of early Afro-Caribbean people within the context of historical African eco-spirituality and folklore, while looking at the relationships the indigenous first peoples of the Caribbean and past and present Pan-African struggles for land freedom and the survival of their ancestral biocultural ways of being and knowing. So this is really a look at how, as a people, we have existed with the biodiversity in the landscape before it became what it is now, and really to look at what survival would have been and their interactions, primarily as is the title of this presentation speaks to, their interactions with wild birds that would have existed at that time. So I think this is really an interesting spin on heritage and natural history. So without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Douglas, and we hope that everyone will have a wonderful time. Please feel free to drop your questions in the chat and raise your hands. You can use the raise hand feature if you want to interject to ask a question. And of course, we have our usual question and answer segment later on. Dr. Douglas?
Thank you very much. Delighted everybody to be here this evening. First of all, let me say that if you did attend the in-person launch of the Reimagining Nanny project at IOJ on Sunday, November 27th, you have seen 50% of this presentation already. So you'll be seeing the remaining aspect of it because time was very limited at the time. And the presentation will continue to grow because it is ongoing in terms of research. So again, thank you for this important invitation. And I'm really looking forward to spending this time in discussion with you. All right, so for today's presentation, I also just want to say that this is a work in progress. And I am looking forward to your thoughts and ideas as a part of the discussion, because when we're talking about these issues of culture, obviously I'm not the only Jamaican here. I'm not the only Caribbean person here. And we all share experiences, knowledge that actually can contribute to these important discussions, because actually there's still a lot that is unknown. And even within our home country of Jamaica, our awareness, knowledge, background of some of the issues we're going to be talking about varies, and that variation is very, very important. So as we heard from Lorianne, this project and my presentation is rooted in the Reimagining Nanny project that is currently on display at the Institute of Jamaica, downtown IOJ. So what this project is about overall is using research scholarship, looking at oral tradition to create this counter narrative to what is described as the Columbian exchange or the colonial experience. Is that this process that we have all been through the last 400 to 450 years, the colonization of the Americas, the introduction of new people and culture has privileged certain types of knowledge. When you look back at what has been written, as we already know so well, history is written by the victor, and it's written to please the victor and to celebrate the victor. And even when we look at the names of plants and animals around us, they do exactly that. You know, even going to birds, because we're going to be talking about birds today, when we think about birds like the Jamaican toady. Well, let's not even think about the toady right now, but even some of the local names that we call the toady, you know, robin redbreast, stuff like that. Well, you know, the toady was named after a robin in Europe. In the that's where the whole robin comes from, and it's here in the US too. The American robin is, of course, saying that it looks like the robin, but this is actually the American version of it. And, you know, then we call our bird robin. So we can just see how this whole experience, you know, everything that we do, how we dress, how we speak, the common names that we call things have been heavily affected by the process of being colonized. We don't know what the toady was called by indigenous people. That name has been lost to history. We don't even know things about ourselves. I was looking just last night at a restaurant in Jamaica that I want to go to, and they describe themselves as a mixture of Indian, Asian, and European foods. I was like, oh. You know, and you know, here they are. They're selling the bammies and the classic Jamaican dishes, you know, the sorrel for Christmas. And people forget that sorrel is from West Africa, that the bammies that we're eating are from the Tayano, that this thing we call jerk is not Asian, it is not Indian, it is not European. We learned these things from the indigenous people. The yams that we eat are from Africa. So many things, the sweet potatoes, they are from the indigenous people of the Americas. You know, we really need to do better than describing our food in terms of these cultures from across Europe and Asia, and start to celebrate what we have and be proud of our own heritage, including the European and Asians, but not saying falsely that these things, all of them are Euro-Asian, which is just not the case at all. So the genesis of this project is looking at pre-colonial ecological symbolisms across African continent and how we have a better understanding of this. I'm just going to give you a few examples. And again, I shared these during the launch of the art exhibit. So when we talk about symbolism and symbolic representation, again, we can look back to science and the history of colonialism and understand that the idea of symbolic representation was ascribed to Eurasians. The idea of the development of art, things that were used for meaning making to represent other things, were up to relatively recently were thought that humans developed these attitudes after they left Africa. However, more recent findings are showing that actually symbolism is rooted in the African continent, developed in the African continent, and it spread out of Africa. I'm just giving you one example because it is one of the oldest examples known, and this is actually a necklace. It's a necklace made from shells, and it is over 100,000 years old. And it was one of the first evidence that shows that way back, remember 100,000 years ago, there was no Asia, there was no Europe in terms of people being on these continents at that time just yet. But people were already making jewelry. They were tying things around their neck. They were putting things on their heads, adornment. They were doing this to show status, to show rank, and for other reasons as well. Some of it was just belief systems that they had, but it was a very important understanding of symbol making. Another example, again, which has become really well known, is the use of ostrich eggs to make beads. And again, this is jewelry which was being made, again, tens of thousands of years old. On a personal level, I was drawn to these examples because I was very fascinated that we're using eggshells, they were using seashells, very much in the vein of what we describe as things that a naturalist myself would be interested in terms of shells and birds, etc. I'm just showing you this example of a map right here. This is West Africa. We can see in this corner Sierra Leone, going down to Cote d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, Ghana, Togo and Benin, Nigeria, and Cameroon. And I want to point out that when we talk about the majority of DNA in terms of who the ancestors of Jamaican people are, 95, upwards of 95%, this is where our ancestors would have come from. Here we have just a map, a statistical map showing in terms of these journeys. People from further south primarily went to Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil. And people from the more central areas, as I said, from Nigeria, Benin, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, etc., were going into the Caribbean and into the United States. And it is estimated that, as you can see Jamaica here, approximately 1 million Africans were brought during the colonial period to Jamaica. What knowledge did they bring with them is a question that we can ask. They had their names, they had their belief systems, they had culture. What became of it? Well, a lot of that culture was actively suppressed. One of the things that the colonial life was about, and the colonizers most feared, was revolt. And they also feared things like being poisoned by those that they enslaved. For this reason, they actively had a system of penalizing people who understood plants, tried to maintain cultural ways, in other words, did not identify with the plantation and the plantation system. Those people were usually killed. And those people who more readily accepted colonial life on the plantation, a Eurocentric way of living, were rewarded. Those who would give up their names most easily, etc., they were rewarded with status, various things in terms of rank on the plantation. So there was a very systematic oppression that happened. So we can understand that none of us know our African names. We don't know what language we spoke. We know nothing. And this has been lost for quite a few hundred years in the region. A few things persist. And I would like to argue that in the field of music, etc., this has been very, very well studied. We understand many things in terms of the Kubinan, the African influences that have influenced so much of Afro-Caribbean music in Jamaica, in Brazil, in Cuba, all over the Caribbean. There has not been a lot of attention, however, to the ecological. Here I'm giving you an example, one of the ones that is relatively very well known, that owls in Jamaica are called patu. And this word patu is a word which is from Ghana. It's a Twi word. It's from the Akan language. And I apologize for the very poor nature of this scan, but in the central column here, you can see, besides scientific name, Akan names. And this is from the book Birds of Ghana. And they have about 15, 16 owls in Ghana. And 50% of these owls are called, you guessed it, patu. So it was a very common word that was used for owls in Ghana. Owls were relatively important in terms of how they were revered in Ghanaian and West African culture. And the word has been maintained over 3,000 years until present day, where Jamaicans will still see an owl. A Jamaican owl, it kind of looks like, as you can see, the owl. This is just one example of the 15 owls in Ghana. We call our owls patu. The birds are not closely related at all genetically, but they kind of look similar. And our ancestors called them that, and the name has persisted today. So when I started the project about reimagining Nani, I was working with a professor of African religion, and he was the first person. So this was dialed back to October last year, that birds were very symbolic in a range of West African cultures. And one of the examples he gave on a webinar that we did for the Reimagining Nani project, that the crowns of the Obas, so these are cultures in Nigeria and Guinea, those cultures, that the kings were adorned with birds. This was actually something that really struck my interest, and I became very interested to find out, well, what kind of bird? Like any old bird, like chicken bird, or what was special about these birds and why birds? He did explain quite well that the birds were symbolic of the queen mothers in Ghanaian West African culture, and that the king drew his power from a line of queen mothers, and it was the queen mothers that actually chose the future kings. And therefore, this was what these birds represented. Based on this, I started to dig deeper, again, looking at not only this culture that existed in terms of these crowns in Nigeria, Cameroon, going back into Equatorial Guinea and these areas, but what birds meant for West Africans in general. I found that the birds actually were not hard to find. So this is from April of this year. It's from BBC News, and it's from a beauty pageant for men. And this is actually a parade that is happening in the streets of the Ivory Coast, the Côte d'Ivoire. And as you can see on this crown right here at the front, you can see very clearly that there are 3 golden birds on his crown. So this is definitely something which is not just 18th century or earlier. It is something which is still rooted in popular culture in the region today. What I discovered more importantly was that a bird in West Africa was not a bird. Birds were treated differently based on the type of birds. And there were some birds that were very, very important for religious purposes going back for hundreds of years. And one of the most important of these birds was African hornbills. So like the owls that I mentioned, that there were 15, 16 different species of owls, there are many species of hornbills. Hornbills are old world birds. They're not found in the Americas, but they are found in Africa, into Asia. They're very common in India, etc. A lot of different species, and Africa has a lot of species. They are actually a bird that originated in Africa. They evolved on the African continent. And this is a piece, as you can see here, from the Met Museum, and it is called the Bird of Prophecy, or the Oro bird, O-R-O. It's from the 16th century, and this is one of the pieces which came from the culture of Benin in present-day Nigeria, and they were very popularly made around 1500, 1515, going into later in the 1500s. And they were used very ceremonially. The beak of the bird was actually struck with another piece of metal to actually make a charm. And as a procession would go, the beak would have been struck to make this this sound as a procession proceeded. Now, hornbills in West Africa and in Central Africa go by several names. And I am sharing a few of these here. You can see this one from the Benin, the bird of prophecy, which I've represented here. In some cultures in West Africa, they're also called old man bird, old man of the forest. They're also called in some cultures a rain bird, that they are believed to herald the end of the dry season and the coming of the rainy season. And again, put yourself back in the 12th century, 13th century, 14th century, 15th century. The end of the dry season and the coming of the rains were very important for agriculture, for a whole range of things. It was a pastoral type of life. So the rainbird being the symbolic of the end of the dry season and the coming of the rainy season was very important. And for a similar reason, it was also called the thunderbird. And this term thunderbird goes all the way down into Southern Africa, into Namibia, into South Africa. Again, so a very broad range, many cultures, many countries revered the hornbills. What I'm going to do next is just to give you a little bit more meat and detail in terms of how this played out and how it looked. So again, I don't know how much of you know the history, but at the end of the 1800s, Britain went to war with the Kingdom of Benin. Benin and the United Kingdom were trade partners for centuries. Benin started to feel that the agreement was not in their favor. When they tried to change the terms of the agreement, Great Britain invaded. This was around 1887. And the kingdom was pretty much the end of the Kingdom of Benin at the time. At this time, what are now known as the Benin bronzes were pillaged. They were taken out of the country. Those soldiers who went to invade and to capture and whatever horrors that they did, they transported the treasures of Benin back mostly to the United Kingdom, but to Europe. And in the last decade in particular, Nigeria, the government of Nigeria has been calling for the return of these bronzes to their rightful place in Benin. So on the left here, we can see this gentleman, Mark Walker. He is the descendant of one of those who actually had invaded. And he has decided of his own will to return these pieces that he's now giving to the Nigerian official on the left. And I just want to point out the bird here, as you can see that long beak on the left. A few more examples here. This is from the Ivory Coast. Not going to go into the text, but just want to point out the bird's beak you can see on the top of this mask and this one here. Another example from the Ivory Coast. You can't see the detail of the bird, but I'm going to read the text here. It says, the elongated forms flanked to the lower part of the mask symbolizes the hornbill, one of 5 primordial animals created by the creator God. So this text is important because, like many texts which I've identified, it identifies that the hornbills in this part of Africa were among the top most important animals in terms of religious beliefs. I'm just going to show you the picture here, a close-up, so you can see what that hornbill would have looked like. You can see the bird on the top of this mask here. Another mask, this is from the Ivory Coast. And I'll read again what it says. Traditional sculptural figures and masks played an important role in Poro society. It's a local group of people, the Poro. An example is the Gabarga hornbill figure, believed to represent the Senkufa primordial ancestors, the creator of the world and the mother of the village. And I'll just read what is in bracket here. Mother of the children, the first ancestor, and bird. So that is actually how this name was constructed. So again, just text to kind of show that the hornbills, as you can see, are linked to the belief system of how the creation happened and is believed to be the mother of humankind in those cultures, so to speak. So I would argue a very important figure that hornbills played in the local belief systems. Now, my question to everybody, and I would appreciate, even if it's just one answer, if you believed that these birds that were very important in sub-Saharan African culture, that this belief system or remnants of it might be present in the Americas, in the Caribbean, where the enslaved African came, how would you go about finding it, or what would you expect to find? Where would you look? If you want to put it in the chat or wherever, but I'd be very interested in just to hearing if you had a thought about that. So if we have a belief system that our ancestors had, that, hornbills created the world, that they're the mother of humankind, the entire creation story is wrapped up in the hornbill, how do you even go about trying to think about how to uncover this now in Jamaica?
The oral tradition.
Oral tradition, yes, very important. Would you look on one island or multiple islands? What do you think? I think there's something in the chat. Let me see. Songs, chants, mass, yes.
Someone says everywhere.
Somebody says everywhere.
Yes.
All right, I agree. So if this is really true, if this bird was so important, and I'm going to give you an example. I'm just going to stop sharing for a minute, just to allow you to reflect on this. If you had something which is very central to our identity, let's say some things that are very central to our identity is, let's say, gender, for example. So let's say you were of one gender and you were put into the body of another person who was not of that gender. Do you think you would just forget what gender you were? No, right? And if you were Christian or whatever and you got put into another place, do you think you would just like forget it? Quite likely not. Especially if this is something which is very central to how you identify and see yourself, and especially if it is something which is pervasive. It's not just like in one little group here in Burnt Ground in Westmoreland or Happy Grove, and it's nowhere else in Jamaica. But if it is everywhere, you kind of would expect that it would translate somehow. So this was where I started to dig, is the hornbills of Africa, are they present in the Jamaican context? Obviously, I am from Jamaica. Now, the giveaway for me, let me go back, was when I saw these names, rainbird, old man bird. These two in particular struck a chord because I had heard these names before. And for those of you who are members of BirdLife Jamaica, I remember this time, and I actually put something in the chat, in the WhatsApp chat, and I asked members of BirdLife Jamaica to tell me what birds were called rainbird in Jamaica. The responses I got initially were not these birds. The responses I got were the swifts and the swallows. Those birds correctly in Birds of Jamaica, if you look in the book Birds of Jamaica by Down and Sutton, the swifts and swallows are called rainbird. And again, when the rain falls, you can see them and they're flying around. These aerial feeders, they'll be eating all the insects and stuff that have been disturbed by the change in weather and stuff like that. Made perfect sense. Yes, the quackwa bird, exactly. Thank you. But what came after, people then remembered, and it came after in the chat, that the cuckoos in Jamaica were also called rainbird. And this then becomes important for what happens next. So this is what I'm showing you is just a picture from Herb Raphael's iconic book, A Guide to the Birds of the West Indies. And let us look here, Puerto Rican lizard cuckoo, the Hispaniolan cuckoo. We have the Jamaican lizard cuckoo, chestnut-bellied cuckoo, the bay-breasted cuckoo of Hispaniola. So I wanted to put this to the test. Is it just, first of all, because, these coincidences are thing, sometimes it's just coincidence, nothing more, that the Jamaican cuckoos were called rainbirds. All right. So the Puerto Rican lizard cuckoo is called Pájaro del Lueva. Anybody who speaks Spanish can translate that second word, L-L-U-V-I-A. You speak Spanish, shout it out.
Someone shouted rain.
Rain, exactly. So the Puerto Rican lizard cuckoo is also called rainbird. All right. Now, I'm going to just mention these. This is not rain. This taco of Hispaniola cuckoo, also the same for the bay-breasted cuckoo, but I'll get back to that. So birds of the West Indies also suggest something else. So the chestnut-bellied cuckoo is called old man bird. The lizard cuckoo is called old woman bird. And again, this made perfect sense to me because I grew up in country in Clarendon. And there were good reasons why I felt like this name made sense. Until again, I recognized that a Ghanaian bird was also called old man bird. But again, this could be a coincidence too. But not only are the Jamaican cuckoos called rainbirds, they're called Maybirds. And this second name, Maybirds, separates them from the swifts and swallows, because the swifts and swallows in Jamaica are called rainbirds, as are our two cuckoos, but the swifts and swallows are not called Maybirds. May, the May rains in Jamaica, is the end of the dry season. Said Jack's Hill going to catch on fire in come March and April, height of the dry season. Thank God when May come, rain. It is the end of the dry season, Maybird. So this again was a clue for me that there was something happening here. It's not only about rain, but it was at the end of the dry season rain, again, tying in with what we know from the literature from the West African cuckoos. So let me talk a little bit about this these names from Hispaniola here, the bay-breasted and the lizard cuckoo, the T-A-K-O. So this word is spelled in differently, T-A-K-O or T-A-C-C-O. And a book about the Haitian Revolution gives some indication of where this name comes from. The Haitian national bird known as taco, the 1800s, so 1802, by the way, is when the Haitian Revolution was in effect. It was actually in the process of the revolution at that time. It lasted a few years. Use the term taco related to the Maroons and guerrilla fighters against French soldiers. And I'll just skip down to the end. The taco bird feasts on the Zandalites, that is the lizards. Of course, it's a lizard cuckoo. Therefore, the author is suggesting that the Maroons of the Haitian Revolution adopted the name of the lizard cuckoo of Haiti for themselves in their Maroon guerrilla warfare fight against the British. Again, I felt that this is a clue because, I mean, why the lizard cuckoo? I mean, it had to have some meaning, some importance, some relevance. It meant something to them that they chose that specific word. And again, remember in 1882, slavery was still in effect. People were still actively arriving from Africa. They would have known the hornbills. It is quite likely, of course, we cannot prove this. We're not saying that this is fact by any means. Because we, unfortunately, with historical things, can't go back and just ask people, why did you say this, or why do you believe this, as in social science today? But it definitely does suggest that they actively, consciously made a choice to align themselves with a bird only found on Hispaniola, and we have to ask ourselves why that is the case. For me, it makes sense that West Africans arriving in the Caribbean would have chosen our cuckoos. When you look at the hornbills, one of the things which is very striking about both group of birds, which are not related, again, our cuckoos are only in the Caribbean. African hornbills are not found in the New World, but the way how their body is laid out and even how they fly is very, very similar. What the cuckoos lack are these heavy bills. And of course, we don't have birds with those type of heavy bills in our region at all. But we can question it whether or not, if you were coming in with such belief system in terms of that the creation of the world and the mother of all people was embodied by a certain bird, might you not look to find these birds in a new environment in which you lived, be it Jamaica, be it Hispaniola, be it Cuba, be it Puerto Rico, or wherever you found yourself, and project your knowledge and experiences onto these birds and call them by similar names. Rainbird, old man bird, you in terms of how you identify with this bird. So I'm going to leave it at there because I would like to take questions. This, as I said, it is an ongoing body of work. Needless to say, I strongly believe that we need to have a deeper look in terms of African retentions within the natural world, within ecology, within the environmental sphere. The historians and the scholars have run away with the issues of music and the language and have clearly identified the retentions there. I think there are undiscovered retentions within the ecological realm that we will be able to discover once we start to ask more questions about what names mean, how did these names come about, and that there is more to learn. And finally, I hope you get to go and see the Reimagining Nanny exhibition at IOJ before it closes. It closes on the last day of March of next year. Thank you very much.
Hi, good evening. I'm interested in that previous slide, we're referring to the taco bird. The italics, that is which language? That's an indigenous language?
Let me go back to that one. This one.
Correct.
This one here?
Yes, that's correct.
Yes. So it's a different spelling, but going back to this slide. So this, as I said, is the page from Herb Raphael's Brother West Indies. And as you can see, the local names for the Hispaniola and lizard cuckoo is spelled in two ways here: T-A-C-K-O on Haiti, and in the Dominican Republic is T-A-C-O-T, and the same for the other cuckoo as well. So when I read this book, it was suggesting that the T-A-C-C-O is the same as T-A-C-K-O, was just different spelling. So it's here they're using the Haitian Creole.
Okay, interesting.
Yes.
Because I'm in Trinidad and Tobago, and this word you said it's Zandolite. We call these lizards Zandoli here. Yeah, so that's interesting.
Yes.
It's good to know that it's the Creole that's connecting us.
Indeed, absolutely. Yep, thank you. I don't know, let me see if oh. Let me stop sharing my screen so I can see the chat.
Are there any other questions? Well, Lisa Gordon says, thank you for such an informative, interesting anthropological seminar.
You're most welcome. You're most welcome.
Any other questions? Please feel free to use the raise hand feature or type your questions or comments in the chat. Well, I have a question in the meantime, Leo. I have not seen the exhibition, Reimagining Nanny, but could you give us just a sneak peek into that first part of the presentation that you had done in terms of how what you have mentioned here in terms of our ancestral connections to how we would have viewed the birds and what it is likely that our ancestors would have experienced in terms of their interactions with the birds, not only in terms of what they may have been called, but do we find anything in terms of how we view them even now? You know, there's stories about certain birds in our culture, what you can and can't do, what you should do if you see one or
Yes.
hear one.
Yeah, very good question. So the first thing I want to say is that our relationship to plants, birds, environment is rapidly dying, which is one of the reasons why I initiated the Reimagining Nanny project. As I spoke about when I did at the art exhibit, I spent 4 years following 500 high schoolers in Jamaica. They were in the West, primarily rural, Petersfield, Mannings, Hampton, Stets, and it was very clear that they had very negative attitudes towards the outdoors, to forest, to biodiversity in general. For too much to actually get into a lot of the specific findings of that project. But these relationships are dying. In my grandparents' day, the way how they saw trees is very different. My grandparents, first of all, they had their children's navel string planted with trees. They planted trees for a range of reasons, including their death. They had trees to say, okay, you know, like, you know, when my dead, that is where my coffin wood is going to come from. And a lot of these are unrecognized as things that we have inherited from all the way going back to Africa, the way how we see specific trees, most notably saber trees, the silk cotton trees, that the writing is very clear. 200 or so years ago, people would, with great fear, to trouble much more to cut down a cotton tree. Like nowadays, I mean, people don't even know it's a cotton tree, first of all. So our relationships to biodiversity has changed. And for me, one of the findings that was most disturbing from the high school study was where the students, the Jamaican students, would say that Jamaicans do not do these things. You know, this is not us. You know, this is what David Attenborough does, and, you know, all them foreign people and, you know, them white people and stuff like that. And I listened with horror because as I'm trying to demonstrate, Africans came with very deep, very central awareness of the outdoors. It is the process of being exposed to colonialism that has robbed this from us. And it is leading us down a path where we are now then surrendering our own flora and fauna to outsiders, which is, I believe, beyond sad. I think Damani had his hand up and there's something in the chat. Let me see.
Yes, Damani, please go ahead.
Hi everyone. Hi Leo. Great
Hey, Damani.
presentation again. It's a two-part question. So one is on still on birds, and the other one will venture into other biodiversity and African connection. So it's fairly often when introducing persons, and it happened actually last week to the POTU, where the discussion about POTUs and PATUs and owls comes up.
Mm-hmm.
I was somewhere and I heard a POTU calling, and I said, "Oh, that's a POTU." And then someone said, "You mean a PATU?" And you go into the thing of, well, not exactly, not an all this, but people use the term PATU for the POTU as well, which is understandable. It looks like a PATU. But with the POTU, that being its standard English name, not it's curious to me, chicken and egg, if whichever Western influence decided to call this New World bird that they would have, because I don't think they don't have a European equivalent. If Africans came, saw this bird, called it a patu, the Westerners didn't have a word for it or a European equivalent to say, "Oh no, that is an owl," and just said, "Okay, that is a patu, potu," or however they assimilated or bastardized the word. And then that is where the standard English name for this group of birds, potu, may have come from. Because I find and again, this is all hypothesis, coincidental that the standard English name for this bird that is mistaken for an owl has the West African / Creole name as a standard English name. So that may actually be something very interesting to look into, and I'm not sure where one would start. And so that's the first one. The second one is with the carrying over of the African knowledge and relationship with biodiversity. I often wonder where certain things have come from when it comes to herpetofauna. So we don't have any venomous snakes or reptiles in the Caribbean, for the most part, right? And the galliwas, which is a lizard, our Jamaican saying, and I've come to understand that in many other Caribbean islands, there are similar fears when it comes to the galliwas, about it being venomous. Here, if it bites you, you have to get to water before it does, or you'll die. And there's this fear of lizards, snakes, and this galliwas, which is just a lizard, a serpentine lizard for the most part, that came down in folklore and came through what I would again assume is from a West African influence. And I would love to know and I'm assuming it's a snake, what snake in West Africa would have elicited such a fear and concern that when they would have come across these galliwas. And recently I found out that Jamaica actually had 2 other species similar in size to the presumed extinct Jamaican giant galliwas. There were 2 that were recently described from museum specimens using DNA and other things that were mislabeled, that were sizable animals like the Hispaniolan one and the Montserrat galliwas. And it's surmised, I think, that those are the ones that the fair was associated with. And I figured no one was spending any time to suss out whether this thing is good, bad, or indifferent. And you have these fairs that are passed on. And like you said, there must be other things that would have been transcribed or translated in belief and applied to things that you are now dealing with in your new home.
Thank you for those questions. Just to talk about the Patu one first, and I'll go back to that slide that I shown. Again, you really can't see much of the detail in this slide, but if you go back, it's very curious when we see that in Ghana, because this is from the birds of Ghana, the owls in Ghana, of all this list in the Akan language, there's no other name for an owl. It's either that there is no name or the local name is Patu. You can see it here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 times. And in some cases, they call it Patu something else, Patu this, Patu that, some other name that is being added on, which we don't know because we don't speak Akan what those are. So I say that to point out that it was, it seems very plausible that night birds in Jamaica, irrespective of whether or not it's a real owl or, but it looks like an owl, it's a night bird that then arriving Africans would have called these birds as a group Patu. But that at least seems to make sense as in keeping with people who at least came from this part of West Africa. For the herpetifauna, boy, that one is more of a mystery because the look into what these names meant and how people would have felt is really just unknown and is ground that needs to be broken. I'm just going to the question that Galaxy has in the chat that says, what do you think why there is this deterioration of the relationship with nature since my grandparents? Well, the unfortunate thing why I feel that this project is so urgent, when you do, what do you call that name again, where you tell somebody the word and you whisper and you're going along the line.
Telephone.
Exactly. As it progresses, it changes and information gets lost. And people forget a little bit, what was that again? What did that mean? And I find that doing even with what my parents tell me, we need to start writing things down. One thing I say that I found very important when I started looking at books like Birds of the West Indies and books that Herb Raphael, the author of this, because he lived a lot of time in Puerto Rico, he was interviewing people and actually writing down what they meant by these words, like, what the bird do. And he would say, it is believed that, and it is believed that. In other words, he's stating that this is not something that has been put to scientific fact or testing, but that this is what people in the culture associate these birds with. Those things are important because later on you can start, as I am trying to do, start to make sense of these things. Like, these birds here were called using and associated with arriving Africans who identified as maroon. If they chose this bird, it must have been significant. They're calling it using these names in terms of the end of the dry season, rain bird. Even in Spanish, they're calling it this. Again, you can start, but if that information is not preserved. So from my grandparents and before them, we're constantly losing this information. Another big thing which I discovered with the high schoolers in my study is that they associated nature with being backwards, that they felt like, I am not going into the forest, like, people are going to say this and people is going to say that. I need to have these prestigious jobs. The girls would say like, sir, like, how am I going to wear my high heels and, all of this type of stuff. We have been acculturated in terms of what it means to be prestigious, what it means to be successful, and overwhelmingly conservation, nature careers do not fit that bill. So young people in particular are moving away. We see that the rural urban migration, the migration into the big cities across the world. Jamaicans don't even want to go want to go country. If they live in Kingston, they're going to Miami. So there are many reasons for this, but it is definitely happening, and we need to think about and consciously how to address some of these concerns. I also saw a question earlier on in terms of the trees and stuff like that. I spoke a little bit about that in terms of the cotton trees. And again, a lot of this information is being lost, how we see trees, how we value trees. Again, Jamaicans, and this came out in the study with the high school students, have unfortunately increasingly a negative attitude towards forests. Is bush. And this word bush comes with a very negative connotation. It's something that you need to get rid of. In other words, it's things that will scratch you up and all of these type of stuff. Plant grass and the zaza grass and stuff like that. That is better. So again, we can see that these relationships are being lost, and no surprise, the people who are coming and hiking in our forests are Europeans and etc. This is not ingrained in Jamaican culture. It's a discussion that we have in BirdLife Jamaica and Birds Caribbean as well, in terms of our membership, who we're attracting, in terms of what it means to increase membership. These are important concerns for us.
Okay, thank you so very much. Are there any other questions or comments? There were some other comments above a poet, Alison Weeks, as a poet trying to look at these disconnections and connections through new eyes. It is stunning to me to hear you say Africans arriving in the Caribbean must have looked around for the birds they knew. They would have tried to orient themselves in their bewilderment by the details of the natural world. Thank you so much.
Yeah. And thank you for that note, Alison. I can only imagine what it must have been like, for millions of people have been uprooted, and all they had was what was in their heads, their beliefs, the systems, their experiences that they have had. And when they came, they must have been actively seeking out, trying to match these things to what they're seeing, in some cases with success, quite likely, as we are suggesting here. But it absolutely must have been the case. And the more we can discover about that, I think it's going to be really very interesting for us. I want to point out as well that it is very clear, looking at these questions, that different islands have different parts of the puzzle. Cuba has certain cultural societies that are well known from West Africa, and again are nature-based societies that came across in terms of how men and women transitioned from adolescence into adulthood, and these were associated with certain beliefs about nature, and some of these have been identified in Cuba. And again, I just don't believe that work has been done in Jamaica.
Alison says, thank you. There is a request from Dorian Rowan Campbell. Please, can you look at our trees and our ancestors' relationship to them and other flora next time?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you. To be honest, just to say why I have not paid so much focus on trees is that relative to the birds, even though I completely agree that we know very little, there has been relatively more interest paid to the plants. Just this summer, there was an ethnobotanical conference held at the University of the West Indies, and speakers were speaking to this knowledge of plants in terms of medicinal plants, everything from the guinea hen weed and various things, the king of the forest, all of this stuff, that there has been more attention. I just have not seen any attention, really, at least not in Jamaica, in terms of African heritage and birds. So I'm definitely interested in spending a little bit more time. I think there's a lot more to discover. So many Jamaican birds, you know, when I hear the bird that is the Jamaicans have a bunch of names for it. It's the striped-headed tanager. They call it champa biza, all this stuff. I mean, these are not English words. Where did those names come from? You know, we really need to ask more questions and be more thoughtful about this. I think we can discover a lot more once we start to ask these type of questions.
Thanks, Leo. Lisa says, I remember hearing about your sad experiences with young students and how few showed interest in nature. What ideas can groups like NHSG and BirdLife bring to the youth to entice them?
Excellent question, Lisa. Even though I shared that experience from my study and it seemed overwhelmingly negative, there was something that was really positive that came out of the study. What the study showed as well was that there were certain things that could be impacted by environmental education. How my study was designed was that we had an experimental group, which was half of the 500 students, and a control group. And we were comparing them from they were 12 until they were 16, going on 17, second form to fifth form. And certain attitudes were very consistent. Us going in, taking them on birding experiences, you know, giving them bird identification cards, doing workshops with them had no effect whatsoever on how they felt then or by the time they were in fifth form. Some things changed. There was also a gendered component as well, which I'm sure that this group would find very interesting. But again, our time finished. The boys responded differently relative to the girls, to the intervention, so to speak. That means us going in, leading workshops with them, taking them on field trips to Marshall's Pen, out into the coastal areas to see wetland birds and to see a patu and have them observe bird banding and stuff like that with the Smithsonian group. So to your question, what the experiment clearly showed was that first-hand experience, environmental education has a profound effect on students. We need to get our primary school, our high school children out of the classroom. We need to get them to go on field trips, having them interact in immersive, engaging experiences about plants and animals. I'm happy to see Professor Eric Garraway on the call because I know Dr. Garraway knows what I'm talking about. When you expose young people to environmental experiences, it will impact their entire life, irrespective of if them still turn out to be the lawyer, the doctor, or the thief. It is going to live with them, and this is what was the positive thing. Do not expect them, however, to become a Damani Calder or that is not going to be everybody. Only the study clearly showed, like out of 500, it was below the significant level, below the 5% level that were expressing an interest in environmental careers. The call of prestige in society, the pressure to become these highly regarded lawyers and doctors and all the wonderful things that we associated with them, it was too strong to tear them away from that career paths where they wanted, even though many of them obviously will never become lawyers and doctors. But they could learn to identify birds. They could describe birds 3-4 years later after being exposed to this information, and their attitudes on a whole range of indices change. So that was very, very positive. Let us continue and do the good work. Not keep these amazing events to just among us and we come and have a great time, which is still important, but to get out into our schools and have students who would not otherwise be able to afford or be so privileged to have environmental experiences. So I think that was a main message from the study. It might not say a bump in the membership now, but definitely we'll be doing a lot for our country.
Thank you so very much, Leo. In fact, the Natural History Society has put it as one of our goals each year to sponsor a student from a rural community to participate in the Discovery Bay Marine Labs summer program. And I'm really happy to hear what you've said the study has shown, because even if everyone that participates does not decide to take on a career in science, there are certain foundations that would have been laid, and we hope that that would result in a change in attitudes towards our environment, and actually recognizing that we are stewards for our environment, and there's a whole lot more that as individuals we can do. So thank you so much for that.
Yeah, thank you.
Ruth O has an interesting question. The ritual of killing a chicken on a building site and sprinkling the blood for the ancestors, is this rooted in the African culture?
Well, I can't say about the chicken per se. However, rituals of this nature are common to traditional people around the world. And I don't want to link it just to Africa. When we hear all of these, what's the name of that film again? I forgot. Gods of something. But traditional cultures around the world, inside and out of Africa, have had ritual sacrifices. The Jews had ritual sacrifices and the use of blood. And Africans also had these practices as well. So it is quite likely, again, I'm not saying that they were using chickens per se, but the
I was just going to ask, did they have chickens running wild in Africa too?
I don't, you ask me a good question, unfortunately, I do not know. Chickens originally are not from Africa. However, there was such level of trade across that quite like, but I do not know when chickens would have gotten to Africa, if that's the question. I just
okay.
Yeah, chickens
Okay,
are from
thanks.
Asia, yes, Southeast Asia particular. Guinea fowls, yes, guinea fowls are all across Africa. I eat guinea fowl here in New York at the Senegalese restaurants. It's amazing. Yeah, but the domesticated yard fowl is from Southeast Asia. I don't know when it
would have arrived in Africa. Okay.
Right.
Thank you. Are there any other questions, comments? This is quite an interesting spin on natural history. Thank you so much, Leo. We see the word history, and often we only think about things being in their natural environment, and we are on one end looking through the looking glass at it, but not recognizing that human beings and human society would have interacted with nature all this time, in perhaps to a different extent than we do now, but certainly it would have had an impact on us and had a lasting impression in terms of how we perceive certain things in present day.
Right, yes, thank you. I also just wanted I do see that there is a new note in the chat from Ambassador Rowan Campbell. Thank you, Ambassador Campbell. I didn't even recognize your name until you said Coffee Growers Association. Yes, the disregard for trees is a big sustainability issue. And just going back to where we started in terms of the Reimagining Nanny project, you know, we're really centering trees in it and our relationship with trees. Again, those of us who attended the launch, one of the first things you might recall that we spoke about was that West African kingdoms were forest kingdoms. We, Jamaicans, we are not from those cultures like the people in East Africa, you know, the Serengeti, those places where, you know, those great herds of wildebeest and run. That's not us. The Kingdom of Benin, from which the bronzes were looted, were places which were tropical forest. Our ancestors had very deep appreciation of trees. When we talk about abeseed, I don't know how many of you know the Jamaican expression, "Jankro know him, but stay before him swallow abeseed."
Abeseed.
Exactly. The abeseed is the palms that we have been eating it in West Africa for tens of thousands of years. We still talk about it today. We had these regards and these connections to plants. And again, they're dying and they need to be revived. We need to encourage people to plant the navel string on the hardwood trees. All of these things, you know, revive them and keep them alive, because they're heritage, their culture for us as people. Yeah, see, Lisa talking about the silk cotton trees again. Yes, definitely. Yeah.
Dr. G says, thank you, Leo, for starting this discussion. I sincerely hope we can find the drive to probe deep into these ideas.
Thank you, everybody. I appreciate the invitation. Looking forward to more.
You've thrown the door open, Leo.
Yes.
Okay, so if there are no more questions, no more comments, I want to say thank you all once again for taking the time to join us. Leo, thank you so much for a very different discussion for us here, but really well received. And for all the persons who have stuck with us, I know some persons have left. Thank you so much. Again, this is our final presentation for 2022. And we absolutely look forward to having you all with us again in 2023. So I wish you all the very best for the season. And I hope that everyone keeps safe, and we'll see you back here next year.
Good night, everybody.
Night, everyone. Thanks again.
Yep. Thanks, Damani.
Good night.